8:30 p.m. Rooftop ballroom above the river. Crystal chandeliers threw shards of light across silk dresses and polished shoes. Waiters stepped between tables balancing trays that smelled of butter and citrus, and a man at the center table laughed loud enough to make glasses vibrate. Outside the glass wall, the city smelled of rain on hot asphalt and diesel from delivery trucks. A black boy of 12 stood 3 feet from that same glass, jacket too small, sneakers patched with duct tape, palms pressed against the cold pane, as if the warmth inside might somehow be pulled through. He had been sent there by a man in a hoodie to hold a cardboard sign while the evening unfolded. Nobody expected him to see more than a silhouette. When the man at the table clutched his throat and slumped into silence, conversation turned to alarm in a second. Plates clattered, a waiter dropped a bottle, someone shouted, "Call someone." The boy did not step back. He stepped forward and said in a clear voice, "I can help." He held up a crumpled page of a medical pamphlet he found in a trash bag earlier that week, and mouthed a few steps he had learned by watching old training videos on a cracked phone. For the people in the room, this was absurd. For the man laughing a few moments before, and now watching his friend turn blue, it looked even more absurd, and he laughed again and said, "I would give him $1 million if he could fix it." The laughter landed like a stone. The boy did not smile. He began to count with his fingers in a rhythm he had practiced in a shelter doorway. What happened in the next 30 seconds would be filmed, shared, and refashioned into argument and law and hope. What happened in those seconds would also force a question that the city had not yet asked out loud. Who gets to heal and who gets to be healed? The balcony air tasted faintly of river silt and spilled wine. The boy, Malik, thin from 2 weeks of shelter meals, had a smell of wet cardboard clinging to his jacket. Inside the room, the air smelled of perfume and lemon oil. Inside voices argued about ambulances and about lawsuits. The patient, the guests assumed was drunk, was not drunk. He was 72, broad-shouldered, cufflinks catching the light as his head lolled to one side. His name was Henry Whitmore. He had been photographed earlier that night signing checks that would shape neighborhoods. The luxury around him made the boy stick out like a sentence in a foreign language. He pulled the pamphlet from his palm and began to describe simple steps he had memorized to open an airway and check for stroke signs. No one wanted a child touching a billionaire. They wanted an ambulance. An ambulance would take too long if this was a blocked airway. The laughter that had promised $1 million was now half incredulous and half cruel. "Will you really let him touch you?" Whitmore asked between breaths. "I would not let that child near me," said a woman across the table. "I do not pay to be fixed by kids," said another. The room grew louder. Malik placed 2 fingers under Henry Whitmore's chin and felt pulse like a thin drum. He smelled the faint metallic tang of a medicine cabinet leak and the desperation someone else had left on the carpet. He did not know the name of the injury for the man people called the magnate. He knew a sequence of actions, and he had faith in the hands that practiced them. He began. 30 minutes earlier, Malik had been walking under the overpass near the river with a scrap of bread and a folded pamphlet stuck in the lining of his jacket. He had arrived that night with the weight of a dozen small humiliations he carried like stones in his pockets. He had been at a shelter that afternoon where the nurse Amina Bello had wrapped a paper wristband around his arm and joked that he could be their most stubborn case or their most promising one. He had spent detail-rich hours at the shelter practicing chest compressions on a plastic mannequin with a deflated rim at its mouth, rehearsing the rhythm of push, 2 breaths. Push, 2 breaths, watching a trembling instructional video until the dialogue was burned into his memory. He had learned to time compressions to the beat of a song he liked a police cruiser sang in the street of the neighborhood. Often a slow count of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. He had discovered that instructional pamphlets sometimes got tossed in the recycling bin outside the community clinic, and that the older patients left diagrams in magazines. He had learned by watching cleaners in clinics fold gauze, by seeing which nurses handled a panic without flapping, by listening in the waiting room when a doctor spoke quietly about airway obstruction and thrombolytics. He was not a prodigy by birth. He was a careful student of the world around him. On the way to the gala that night, he had been asked by a teenager named Marcus, the one who occasionally charged phones in the corner of the shelter, to stand in the doorway and hold a sign while some of the volunteers ran errands. Marcus had said, "Keep your head down, don't cause trouble," which was his way of saying, "Be invisible." There was a busker playing a trumpet under the overpass, the notes sticky with ache. Malik had folded the pamphlet into his jacket because knowledge felt like a small warmth. He had no idea where his steps would lead. He had rehearsed answers for being ignored, but not for being watched. He had memorized the order of compressions when a nurse had scolded him and then quietly shown him. Many times to give rescue breaths. Those 30 minutes were the hinge between the life he had and the life he would touch. Backstory from Malik stretched into a length of years that fit into 3 short paragraphs like a timeline folded up into a pocket. He had been born in a 2-room apartment above a shuttered bakery where his mother worked nights and slept days. His earliest memories were of the smell of sugar and the sound of dough hitting wood. He remembered his mother reading recipe lists like prayers and mispronouncing medical terms she overheard on a daytime show. She would point at scrapes on a neighbor child and say, "You will be okay," because she had folded hope into language the way she folded dough. Malik learned to watch hands because hands told stories his mother could not always say. She had seizures, a slow paring knife of memory loss, and the neighborhood clinic became a place of rituals more than answers. He left school at 11 to help his mother keep appointments, to carry her bag of prescriptions, to learn the names of pills the way other kids learn the names of video game characters. For a while he thought his job was to remember, because remembering was a kind of love. Then the seizures grew meaner, and the clinic told them things that sounded like endings. His mother died in a night that smelled of bleach and rain and leaves blown into the gutters. After that, Malik did not go back to the apartment. He wandered and learned how to sleep in places that felt safe enough to breathe. He read every discarded pamphlet and every open book he found. He traded small favors for charge on a cracked phone and watched training videos until his eyes hurt. His formation was messy and human and full of attempts that felt like small acts of defiance. He wanted medicine not for trophies, to honor the steady way his mother had kept 2 plates on a table and told stories about a future where people did not have to wait so long for a hand. He never imagined a ballroom, a billion-dollar laugh, a challenge that would be filmed and dressed by headlines. He only wanted to be useful. Malik had, by accident, a type of practice that the formal world called unorthodox. He practiced in rain, under fluorescent convenience store lights, inside basements where someone was willing to teach him how to stop a bleed with a t-shirt and a shoelace. He carried knowledge like a string of beads. He had a small notebook with edges taped with clear packing tape, and inside it equations of doses he would never administer, but formulas for compression rates, a drawing of airway tilt, a note that said, "Watch for facial droop." He kept a ziplock of pages in his jacket the shelter provided him once as a kindness, and he treated those pages like a relic. He could not read every medical paper, but he could recognize a pattern that signaled imminent collapse. That pattern had been what he saw when Henry Whitmore shifted and went quiet. When the guest whispered, "Stroke the boy," heard instead the slight choking sound and the smell of vomit washed with someone else's perfume. His observation was clinical and also human. He noticed the color of Henry Whitmore's lips faded to a gray that suggested poor oxygen. He noticed a shallow breath that did not clear his throat. And he noticed the head tilted back a fraction that might have obstructed the airway. He was seeing micro-movements, a flicker of eyelid, a blush of sweat at the temple, the tiny clench of a jaw. To him, those were not metaphors, they were signs, like letters in a language he had learned by watching. He stepped in and said again, "I can help." The room rallied with skepticism. One of the guests, Cynthia Ruiz, who volunteered with an arts charity, said, "You cannot just let a child." And she stopped because a waiter knelt and said, "There is vomit. We need towels." Dr. Elena Park, who happened to be at the event for a fundraiser for the university hospital, stood and crossed the room with a clinical gait. She was in her 40s, hair pulled into a practical bun, and smelled faintly of antiseptic soap under her floral perfume. She listened to Moloch and watched his hands. She had been trained to sanction permission, not to give it to anyone under duress, but to observe rapidly and act. She became a pivot in the night. On one side there was laughter, and on the other there was a man losing breath. The room smelled of panic and cologne and old wood. The contrast between the velvet and the vomit made people blink. The public confrontation that followed felt like theater with stakes. Henry Whitmore woke half in a stupor, as a philanthropic promise became a cruel bet. Henry's friend Marcus Hale, a corporate lawyer with a fondness for jokes and a voice like a radio, said, "All right, let's see it then. Show me." He waved a checkbook like a stage prop and laughed. "I will give him $1 million if he proves me wrong." The camera phones were already up like a constellation of small moths. "$1 million?" said one of the guests, like it was a figure of speech, and then saw the boy straighten and accept the challenge with a steadiness that made the room quiet enough to hear the elevator hum. The humiliation in the room was obvious, as someone from the local news channel, Leela Chen, took a step back to get better angle, and Reverend Samuel Davis in a tux stood with his hands near his chest. Someone muttered, "Probably illegal." The lawyer to the left said, "That is a publicity stunt." The room was a chorus of skepticism and spectacle. The insult was loud. "Will you let that boy touch you, Whitmore?" The boy looked at the man and said, "Yes." The moment thickened into a public reckoning. A woman at the neighboring table whispered, "I would not want him touching me," and the reaction spread. The crowd had more voices than compassion at that instant. There followed a tense negotiation for permission and legitimization that read like a short legal drama. Dr. Park asked for consent. She spoke to Henry in a voice measured and calm. "Are you aware of where you are?" she asked. His eyelids fluttered and he nodded slowly. She turned to his wife Cynthia and said, "We can triage here or call an ambulance. Which do you prefer?" Cynthia hesitated and touched the man's hand like she was making a decision about a map she had never read. Marcus, the lawyer, interjected, "We need a signed waiver if we're doing anything off protocol here." Henry's wife looked dizzy at the thought. The camera zoomed in. Malik was asked if he had experience with emergency airway management, and he answered yes, and then explained in steps how he would clear obstruction and check for pulse. He recited terms he had heard and demonstrated with a mock tilt on his pamphlet. The room grew quieter as Dr. Park looked at his hands and then at the pamphlet. She felt the reality of a delay, the time an ambulance would take, the time for a clot to do damage. She touched Henry's wrist and felt the weak pulse. She said to Cynthia, "We can try him here with precautions. I will supervise." The lawyer Marcus pressed his lips together and said, "If anything goes wrong, there will be lawsuits and people will call this irresponsible." The crowd groaned. Malik did not speak in slogans. He repeated the steps he would take. He said, "I will open the mouth, clear the airway, suction if there is debris, perform jaw thrust, then check breathing, then compress if there is no pulse." He said it without flourish. He handed his small notebook to Dr. Park, who read and raised an eyebrow. The public permission had arrived, not as a gift, but as a tense bargain. The conversation escalated with voices trading across the room until Dr. Park made everyone physically step back. She put on a pair of thin gloves from a nurse who had come forward and asked a nurse named Amina Bello to bring a small roll of gauze and a plastic suction device from her kit. She rinsed her hands with a hand sanitizer that smelled of lemon and herbs and then tapped the little device, making a sound like a plastic click. She asked Malik, "Are you ready?" He said, "Yes." Henry's hand twitched slightly, and someone counted breaths. A cameraman from Channel 9 whispered to Leela Chen, "Don't miss this angle." The room smelled like antiseptic, perfume, wine, and the metallic tang of fear. Dr. Park gave Malik permission to proceed under her supervision. There was a formalization of risk and then an unceremonious clearing of the table for space. The guests formed a ring like the ocean around a point of light. Each person became a potential witness or critic. The public had turned from laughter to judgment and then to an uneasy kind of attention. The procedure itself was a performance of calm and exactness. It started with observation, then moved to action. Malik knelt and placed 2 fingers under Henry's chin while supporting the head with his other hand. His palms damp with sweat, he tasted faint salt. He scanned the mouth and felt an obstruction, a wad of partially chewed food lodged near the back of the throat. He used a hand to pull the jaw forward, performing a jaw thrust, which he had practiced on a plastic mannequin until his hands remembered the angle. The sound of the room narrowed to the hiss of ventilation from an air conditioning vent, the click of a smartphone shutter, a glass knocked partially off a table, and Malik counting aloud. He called out, "Check, airway clear, mouth clear," then he did a sweep with a gloved finger, and the smell of vomit and half-digested salmon hit the air. He felt the obstruction yield. He performed 2 rescue breaths mouth to mouth while Dr. Park hovered with a bag valve mask ready to take over should his breaths not be effective. The patient's chest rose slightly and then more. Malik began compressions at a rhythm he had practiced in sync with a song in his head. The room counted with him, the count like a mantra. In the middle of this, there was a sound that made everyone suck their breath. A small, abrupt pop as the obstruction moved, and a single cough escaped Henry's throat. When Henry cleared enough to breathe more fully, the color returned to his lips like a tide. The sound that came with that was a chorus of relief, and then a sudden spike of applause from a man in a tux who had been holding his breath. The technical explanation that followed was short and clear. Malik had performed basic airway clearance and assisted ventilations, keeping oxygen moving until spontaneous breathing returned, and a preliminary assessment ruled out a major clot. Simple steps executed correctly in sequence can restore oxygenation and prevent irreversible brain injury in the first minutes after airway compromise. This is a matter of physiology and timing rather than mystery. The room erupted into a different kind of noise then. Phones were out and videos began to spread. Marcus Hale, who had laughed a moment before, now stood with his hand to his mouth, eyes wet like someone who had watched a staged scene become truth. Henry's wife wept openly, hugging her husband, while the guests clustered like curious birds. Lila Chen spoke into her camera and said, "This is unexpected footage that may change public opinion." Reverend Samuel Davis came forward, put a hand on Malik's shoulder, and murmured, "God found a way." Ina Bello, the nurse, shook Malik's hand and said, "You did good." Dr. Park collected her thoughts, and the medical team from the gala offered immediate observation and then insisted on a transfer to the hospital for further evaluation. There were names attached to the moment that would travel with it. Dr. Elena Park would be thanked and quoted in articles. Lila Chen would file a piece the next morning. Reverend Davis would tell the story on Sunday, and Marcus would face questions in the next weeks about whether his joke had been cruel or catalytic. There were multiple moments of tension in the hours that followed, and each of them stretched the room into silence, then into argument. First, the medical team debated whether the event had been legally permissible to proceed with a volunteer, a minor, and a private space. Dr. Park argued that delaying even for an ambulance could have cost Henry Whitmore measurable neurological function. The lawyers argued about consent and liability. The second moment of tension was the press conference the next morning, when Henry's aide told reporters that the family was considering legal action against those who had filmed the moment without permission and against the shelter that had allowed Malik to be unsupervised. The third moment of tension was the shelter board meeting, where some members wanted Malik quietly moved to another city and others wanted to capitalize on his presence for fundraising, which felt to him like being commodified. Each moment read like a small trial in which the boy was alternately hero and exhibit. There were public statements that tried to flatten the complexity into a single moral. Each of these moments lasted long enough to change the tone of the narrative and to press everyone involved into positions where rhetoric sometimes ran ahead of fact. Public reaction threaded through the night and into the morning like a current. Video of Malik reached millions in hours. People were asked by the media to choose sides. Henry Whitmore issued a public statement thanking those involved and offering an initial check for $100,000 to the shelter under the condition that he be recognized in the media. Marcus Hale gave a somewhat sheepish interview about the $1 million remark, saying, "I was trying to make a point, and I did not expect it to mean anything." Cynthia Ruiz, who had earlier objected to the child touching her friend, now wrote an op-ed about assumptions and privilege. Reverend Samuel Davis called for recognition of street wisdom. Malik received messages the neighborhood had never seen before, petitions to give him a scholarship to a private school, threats from people who said he had staged the event, and invitations from charities who wanted to help with his future. Dr. Park fielded calls from hospital administrators who wanted to make sure policies were not being violated, compromised, and from ethics boards that wanted details. The narrative had outpaced the simple truth, which was that a boy who had learned from scraps had done a simple series of things at exactly the right time. At around 30% of our story, a natural moment asked the audience to pause and reflect. So we ask you now, have you ever seen someone ignored because they looked out of place and later found out they were the person who could have helped? You can share one brief moment in the comments where someone you know was overlooked and then proved essential. Tell us the place and what happened in a sentence or two. Your examples help show how often we miss the people who might save us, and how small acts of attention can change outcomes. Commenting helps map need and inspire action, and it helps this channel gather cases to report on next. If you felt surprised or moved by Malik, let that surprise become a conversation in the thread, and then keep watching, because the next part shows the complicated choices that followed the viral video. Pause and breathe, then come back to see how the legal, the medical, and the human sides collided. There were scenes where the boy had to prove credentials in ways that felt like exams. At a public hearing at the community center, Malik was asked to demonstrate what he had done. The legal question hovered. How much training is required to perform emergency care in public, and who is protected when they act? Dr. Park testified to Malik's competence in a tone that was careful and professional. She said, "I supervised his actions. He performed under my direction, and his quick assessment and basic airway maneuver were appropriate and life-saving." A representative from the hospital legal team said, "Protocols exist for the safety of both patient and caregiver." A journalist named Leela Chen read rapid comments from viewers who called Malik a hero and others who called him a fraud. Reverend Samuel Davis spoke about dignity and how a community that trains its youth in practical skills can lower harm. A philanthropist named Henry Whitmore, who had been the patient, now offered a checkbook and a hand that trembled slightly. He said, "I will fund an initiative to teach basic life support in underserved neighborhoods." Some cheered. Malik looked at the checkbook and then at the shelter director Marcus, who had been feeding him for weeks, and said, "I just want to keep learning." The crowd was split between wanting to fix the system and wanting to fix the spectacle. The next critical scene was private and brittle. Malik sat with Dr. Park and Marcus and a lawyer named James Porter, who represented a local nonprofit. They needed to decide what to accept and what to refuse. Marcus, the shelter volunteer, who sometimes sold small goods on his street corner, had a thin voice that shook with some pride and awe. Some fear. He said, "You deserve more than this, Malik, but be careful. This city will try to use you." James Porter in a low voice explained legal steps and the risk of media exposure. He asked Malik whether he wanted a scholarship or financial support, or the $1 million offer, which still hovered as an offhand remark that could become a contract if pursued. Dr. Park wrote down options and said, "We can place you in a program with supervised training and guarantee tuition and housing," she said quietly. Malik looked at the checkbook and at the faces and said, "I want to be able to be useful, not just a photo op." There was a negotiation that lasted hours, with phones silenced and promises stacked like fragile plates. In the end, they accepted money for an education fund, but said conditions. Malik would choose the program and remain with a mentor, not be paraded. The room that night smelled of takeout food and the cheap cigarette smoke of people who had been up late. The decision would ripple into the future. The procedural account of what Malik performed in the ballroom is short and precise and worth repeating in clear terms for anyone who wants to understand the mechanics. In a collapsed airway situation, the initial steps are assess responsiveness, call for help, Open the airway using a head tilt chin lift or jaw thrust technique. Clear visible obstruction using a finger sweep if safe and not blind sweep. Provide 2 rescue breaths and begin chest compressions at a rate of 100 to 120 compressions per minute until spontaneous breathing returns or advanced care takes over. This sequence buys oxygen time and mitigates irreversible brain injury. It is a matter of timing and coordinated action with clear targets for pressure, depth, rate, and ventilation that are taught in basic life support courses. There were more moments of tension that fractured an already complicated story. One came when a hospital ethics board questioned whether Dr. Park had erred by supervising a minor without formal parental consent at a private event. Another came when Malik received an anonymous online attack accusing him of staging, and the shelter had to deal with threats. A third came when Marsh Whitmore, a cousin of Henry, who handled his public relations, surged forward to say that the family felt exploited and sought to control the narrative. Each moment pressed different players into moral arithmetic. For Malik, it was about staying steady in a world that narrated him in different keys. For Dr. Park, it was about balancing clinical instincts and institutional rules. For Henry Whitmore, it was about reconciling pride and mortality, and for the shelter, it was about accepting funds without losing autonomy. Public pressure created offers and strings, and each string tugged at the boy. The victory lap was complicated. On one side there was viral affection, calls for scholarship, and a private school named St. Agnes reached out with a generous offer. On the other side, there was the maddening spectacle of talk shows that wanted to reduce everything to sound bites. Malik was offered a full scholarship to a medical technician program at the City College by Dr. Park, who insisted on a proper mentorship and an accredited path. Henry Whitmore wrote a check to fund a community emergency training program, but insisted on naming it in a way that made his family history visible. Malik refused to be a prop. He negotiated conditions with the shelter and with Dr. Park. He wanted housing stability and a place to study that did not smell of bleach. The shelter director Marcus and Reverend Davis became guardians of his consent. They made sure Malik understood the difference between immediate gratitude and binding contracts. The public pressure to make him into the face of philanthropy asked him to give a speech to cameras and to sign on as a symbol. He agreed to speak, but only to talk about training and access. He said in his speech, "I slept on sidewalks, but I learned how to help because someone left a pamphlet they did not need. If you want to honor me, then fund training for people like me." His words landed like a request and not a demand. In the days after the event, media attention turned to policy. Local lawmakers proposed an ordinance to fund basic life support training in community centers. The city hospital system announced a program in partnership with shelters to certify volunteers free of charge. Henry Whitmore used his influence to push a roundtable about community health and liability, and found himself in uncomfortable company with legal counsel and union representatives. Marcus Hale issued a public apology for his earlier laughter and set up a small aid fund. Cynthia Ruiz started a campaign about assumptions and created a series of community dialogues. Leela Chen wrote an investigative piece about how a simple sequence of actions can be seen as miracle or as negligence, depending on the frame. The conversation was messy, and it revealed the extent to which systems that could prevent harm often failed to be organized around the people at risk. There were important names who stepped into the story as witnesses and agents. Dr. Elena Park, the supervising physician who insisted on proper handoff and documentation. Amina Bello, the nurse from the shelter who had the kit that made the procedure possible. Marcus Hale, the lawyer who laughed then apologized. Cynthia Ruiz, the donor who rethought her assumptions. Reverend Samuel Davis, the community leader who saw dignity. Leela Chen, the reporter who framed the story for millions. Henry Whitmore, the patient whose public profile complicated every decision. James Porter, the lawyer for the nonprofit who negotiated terms. Each of them had their own motives and flaws, and each of them had to reconcile what had happened with the consequences. Their names appear not as ornament, but as evidence that a single moment rippled into institutions. There were several technical and moral consequences. Hospitals revised some policies about public intervention, and public relations teams created protocols for moments of viral clinical attention. There were calls for legal protections for Good Samaritan acts, especially for minors who might step in and help. A community hospital reported an increase in volunteers seeking basic life support certification in the month after the video. The press cycles debated whether it was a story of street wisdom or an anomaly. For Malik, there was the personal work of getting through schooling and caring for the shelter friend who had been his anchor. He enrolled in a vocational program and began a supervised apprenticeship with Dr. Park at the community clinic. He learned sterile technique, how to chart properly, and how to write a clear handoff. He studied anatomy with the hunger of a person who knew what the small differences in color and breath could signify. Moments of tension returned when the legal terrain sharpened. An initial offer to make Malik a paid ambassador for an emergency training campaign was rescinded after concerns about exploiting a minor. There was a painful discussion about consent and agency at the shelter board, where some members feared becoming dependent on big donors. There were threats from individuals online who refused to accept the narrative, and the shelter had to increase security measures, which made Malik feel like a prize behind glass. Another tension point emerged when a rival local charity accused Henry Whitmore of using the event for tax write-offs. Each episode required a slow unraveling of facts, mediation, and an insistence that the boy had rights, not slogans. The climax of the story came not as a single instant, but as a convergence of medical demonstration, legal mediation, and public redemption. Malik stood in a community center weeks later as Dr. Park and 3 other instructors certified a room full of volunteers in basic life support. The air was bright with fluorescent lights and the smell of coffee and burned toast from the center kitchen, a smell that made people feel human. Malik taught a small group a proper jaw thrust technique with the careful patience of someone who had learned to teach via small gestures. He felt the hands of others respond, and he watched a woman in her 60s whose hands shook with age suddenly steady when she practiced compressions. Cameras were there, but less insistent. Henry Whitmore sat in the front row and did not speak much. He watched, and when the certificate was given, he stood and applauded quietly. A philanthropist named Henry Whitmore offered a modest fund to establish classes, and, if more was needed, he volunteered to match donations. The offer came with strings that the shelter negotiated off-camera. The community center changed policy and offered a scholarship for 20 students from the neighborhoods most in need. Malik accepted a mentorship at the clinic and a small living stipend that kept him in a safe place to sleep. In the weeks after, more formal things happened. A local clinic led by Dr. Park launched a training program with commitments from a university hospital for staff time and from a charity for funding. A policy paper drafted by James Porter and a city council member recommended legal clarifications to protect volunteers acting in emergencies when under direct supervision of licensed personnel. Reverend Samuel Davis created a small fund to help with housing, and religious communities offered support. The shelter upgraded its training classes and provided Malik with a laptop and structured study time. The attention meant resources and new obligations. Malik took classes in anatomy and patient communication and learned to write patient notes and to call lines on a diaphragm with a stethoscope. He still walked under the overpass sometimes, but with fewer nights on the ground. The epilogue began to answer how an instant of intervention could ripple into institutional change and individual transformation. 1 month later, Malik had a small apartment room provided by a community trust, and he attended his first accredited class at the city college. He was tired and grateful, and he wrote in his notebook that the world now looked less like a series of walls and more like a set of open doors. He had regular supervision sessions with Dr. Park, who insisted they write case notes and a learning plan. The shelter had received an influx of donations and used a portion to expand training programs for youth. The initial check for $100,000 had been redirected into a fund that paid for equipment and instructors, and for the first time, the shelter could guarantee training slots. Henry Whitmore issued a more reflective statement, acknowledging that his life had given him the chance to act, and that he wished to use it to repair neglect in public services. He visited the clinic quietly and met several of the people he had indirectly helped. The city reported an uptick in public trainings and a small but meaningful drop in delayed response incidents in neighborhoods where classes were provided. 3 months after the rooftop night, Malik had begun a formal apprenticeship rotation at the community clinic, and he had a mentor who checked his charting daily. He had been offered a scholarship to a technical school that covered tuition and books, and an arrangement for housing support had been secured through a coalition chaired by Reverend Davis. The public conversation had matured from sensational headlines to policy debates about Good Samaritan protections for minors acting under supervision. And the city council had passed a modest ordinance to fund basic life support training in community centers. A group of doctors led by Dr. Park had published a short report in a local medical bulletin about the event and used it to argue for scaled training programs emphasizing practical, community-based skills rather than elite certifications only. Malik began to teach a once-weekly class to teenagers at the shelter on observation skills and basic first aid, and he laughed when a teenager asked him how long until he would be a doctor. He said, "I do not know, but I know how to keep someone alive for the first minutes, and that is how we begin." 6 months later, the clinic that Dr. Park had helped found in partnership with the community center reported measurable outcomes. More citizens were trained, and there was a team to coordinate volunteers in the event of public emergencies. Malik had a small scholarship in his name for students from shelters who wanted training in emergency medical technician coursework, and the fund supported 3 students that semester. Henry Whitmore had publicly committed to a multi-year fund and set up a program that prioritized community-driven governance over naming rights. The shelter had changed its intake procedures and started offering medical literacy workshops. Malik had a mentor and a plan, and sometimes at night he still watched the city river and remembered the taste of cardboard and the song that helped him keep rhythm during compressions. He had become a bridge between institutions and neighborhoods, and his presence in the clinic had changed staff attitudes about outreach. There were statistical notes in the clinic report, a modest decline in delayed treatment calls in the target neighborhoods, and an uptick in volunteers that reflected not only training but trust. The legacy of the night was not only in money that changed hands, but in systems that changed their approach. Alongside the institutional changes, there were personal reckonings. Marcus Hale continued to work pro bono with the shelter and sometimes brought sandwiches when he found hours to spare. Cynthia Ruiz donated to a fund that supported long-term scholarships and wrote about the experience as a lesson in humility. Leela Chen followed up with a deep profile that explored how narratives form and how the viral moment obscured decades of neglect and creativity. Reverend Samuel Davis kept his pulpit talk focused on dignity and on honoring latent skills in every community. Dr. Park kept writing and teaching and insisted that medical education include community-partnered rotations that she said saved lives in more than one way. Malik accepted neither pedestal nor pity. He negotiated terms and boundaries, and he kept a small notebook he called his map. The lasting image returned again and again in the footage that circulated. Malik placed his hand beneath a man's chin and cleared an airway, and counted, and then sat back as breathing returned. In that image, there was redemption and embarrassment and power, and it asked a public question about who we train and who we trust. The story became more than one event. It forced institutions to consider preventive training, it pushed for policy clarifications, and it pushed individuals to reconsider a prejudice that equated appearance with capacity. It also asked a humbler question: what happens in neighborhoods when knowledge flows both ways? And when institutions are willing to recognize competence wherever it appears. If this story moved you, consider sharing it and subscribing to follow how community solutions scale. We will keep telling stories that connect individual action with policy consequences and that highlight how training and trust must travel together. If you value careful reporting with medical accuracy and human voices, subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the follow-ups that show how change actually gets built. The most important thing you can do right now is tell one person about Malik, and if you can, support local training programs. Consider donating to shelters and clinics that offer accredited basic life support courses. The conclusion is both modest and urgent. In a handful of seconds, a boy who had nowhere was able to act and keep a life intact.
In the weeks and months after the night, pledges became programs, and arguments became policy drafts, and small acts of attention turned into training classes. The change was not complete, and it must be sustained. The final consequence was not only that one life had been saved, but that a set of institutions were nudged toward listening and acting differently. Some people gained money, some gained headlines, but what mattered most was that an ordinary sequence of steps performed with care became a lesson in distributed responsibility. We are left with a choice: either continue to let knowledge be hoarded or invest in making it common. If you believe in hearing more voices, share this story and subscribe so we can follow what comes next. Sometimes, listening is the first and most radical act of care.